We begin with the latest effort by Texas Democrats to fight Republican-backed voting restrictions in the state.
Yeah, in a dramatic move, dozens of Democratic lawmakers fled Texas Monday afternoon, flying to D.C. on a pair of charter jets. The legislators plan to stay there until the special legislative session ends, which is in August. Their goal is to keep Texas Republicans from passing their agenda by making sure they don't have a quorum. NBC News Now correspondent Priscilla Thompson is outside the Texas state capitol this morning. So, Priscilla, we know these lawmakers landed at Dulles Airport near D.C. last night. They're likely going to stay in Washington for a while. What did they say about their decision to flee Texas?
Well, Savannah, Joe, good morning. So one Democratic lawmaker I spoke with told me that had those public hearings not gone the way they did this weekend, this may not have happened. But whenever those hearings went for hours, hundreds of people showed up to testify, largely in opposition to these bills. And Democrats saw that Republicans still passed these bills out of committee along a party line vote with no amendments. They decided that they needed to act. And of course, we heard from those Democratic lawmakers when those planes landed in Washington, D.C. late last night. And I want to play a little bit of what they had to say.
Today, more than 50 Democratic members of the Texas House left Austin and left Texas. Not because we want to. It breaks our heart that we have to do it. But we do it because we are in a fight to save our democracy. The nationwide Republican vote suppression efforts, anti-voter efforts, is coming to a crisis point in the state of Texas right now.
We're here today because our backs have been against the wall. We had no other option. There was nothing left to give. And so we took a stand and we left the state of Texas because that was the best and the right thing to do at the right time.
And the president will be delivering remarks on voting rights later today. Democratic lawmakers from Texas are certainly going to be watching that speech very closely. I'm told that they want to hear him say in no uncertain terms that to call on Congress to pass the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and also the For the People Act. Joe?
Let's talk about the Republican response. Governor Greg Abbott called this special session after Democrats walked out in May to stop a vote on these voting restrictions then. Now he's threatening some serious consequences. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, Governor Greg Abbott is certainly not happy with this dramatic exit that Democrats staged on yesterday. And he says that this is not over. I want to play a little bit of what he had to say on Fox News last night.
Isn't that the most un-Texan thing you've ever heard? Texans running from a fight? They're quitters. State House of Representatives who are here in the Capitol in Austin right now, they do have the ability to issue a call to have their fellow members who are not showing up to be arrested, but only so long as that arrest is made in the state of Texas. That's why they have fled the state. Once they step back into the state of Texas, they will be arrested and brought to the Texas Capitol, and we will be conducting business.
And Abbott says he will continue to call special sessions until his agenda has been addressed. Joe?
So, Priscilla, what is next for these Texas Democrats in D.C., their Republican counterparts back home in Texas? Where could things go from here?
Well, those Texas Democrats will be in D.C., they say, through the first week in August, lobbying federal legislators to take action on that voting rights legislation. As for what happens here, right now, the Texas House does not have enough people to have a quorum. We do expect them to gavel in later today, at which point the House Speaker could set into motion the process of ensuring that if those Democrats do return to Texas during the special session, they could be arrested and brought back here to the Capitol. Joe?
Will be an interesting few weeks. Priscilla Thompson in Austin. Priscilla, thank you.
And as Texas Democrats wake up in Washington, President Biden heads to Philadelphia, where he's expected to give a speech attacking restrictive election laws in GOP-led states and calling for a national coalition to boost voting rights. NBC News White House correspondent Mike Memoli joins us now from Philadelphia. Mike, good morning. And you just had a new piece drop on NBCnews.com like 2 hours ago. So here we are with the exclusive first chat with you. So thanks for joining us. All right. So what is President Biden expected to say to raise the stakes for voting rights reform on the federal level?
Well, Savannah, you just were talking about that big, bold, dramatic gesture that Texas Democrats, feeling that their voting rights are really under siege in that state, made. And a lot of progressive activists and even some of the president's allies are wondering why the president isn't showing the same kind of urgency at the federal level. Well, the White House says you're going to see that from the president today. Yes, he is going to voice support for the People Act. But today, the White House sees this speech as an important opportunity for Biden to take a much longer view. This is a political fight that they think will be waged all the way through the midterm elections. They want to show that there's a price to pay politically for Republicans who are pursuing these kind of changes. They're not ruling out continuing to press ahead with federal legislation, though, as White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki laid out just yesterday. Take a listen.
We don't accept the notion, he's an optimist by nature, otherwise he wouldn't be sitting in the Oval Office right now, that it's dead. We don't accept that. We believe there needs to be a path forward. The president sees his role as somebody who can speak from the bully pulpit to elevate and advocate for the need to move forward on voting rights legislation.
You heard her use that term, bully pulpit, the White House saying that this speech will really not mince words. He will call the kind of Republican voting changes we're seeing across the country un-American, undemocratic, unpatriotic. But the White House sees this not as a speech directed at the partisan activists who've been really engaged in this, but for the ordinary Americans who maybe haven't been paying attention to this on a day-to-day basis.
Right. OK, so now let's talk through, what can happen from here. House Majority Whip Jim Clyburn's endorsement was, of course, a turning point in Joe Biden's campaign to win the Democratic nomination. I mean, it wasn't really until this that we saw this really pick up steam for him. Now the congressman is turning up the heat on President Biden and asking him to push for filibuster reform. So first, how's the White House handling that particular pressure?
Yeah, it's so interesting to see when Jim Clyburn uses that political capital that he has with this White House to pressure them to take certain actions. And he also didn't mince words when I talked to him about this White House approach, trying to take a longer view, focus on the midterms. And he said to me that if we mess up this voting thing, as he put it, we're not going to see Raphael Warnock get reelected to the Senate. We're not going to win a Senate election in North Carolina, in Florida. So he thinks that the president needs to take much more urgent action now. And that's why the White House's approach is to try to make sure that there's popular support beyond Washington for the kind of dramatic steps, including filibuster reforms, that would be required in order to make sure that that For the People Act specifically can get over the finish line. We know it just got barely those 50 Democratic votes when it came up a few weeks ago. Yeah, so I mean, this is exactly what you're saying. Even if the president got on board with filibuster reform, they'd need every Democratic senator on board, which of course includes Senators Manchin and Sinema, to get 50 votes to pass. What's the White House working to specifically get that support on voting rights reform? Well, I spoke with Cedric Richmond, former congressman who's now a senior advisor in the White House, and he said, listen, I understand these activists want the president out there giving these big speeches every day. He said if they wanted a president who was out there just sort of blowing hot air, they had that in the last president, that this president needs to get credit for articulating a strategy, working behind the scenes to get support from key senators like Joe Manchin. They point out that they didn't have 50 votes for the People Act just even hours before that vote in the Senate a few weeks ago. It was the president working behind the scenes, talking with Senator Manchin, who Richmond said talks to him very regularly, that made sure they got that 50th vote. And now you build from that process potentially for some tweaks in the filibuster, like ending the talking filibuster. Mike, Emily, as always, stellar reporting. Thank you for joining us.
The FDA is adding a new warning for Johnson & Johnson's coronavirus vaccine. The agency says the shot has been linked to a rare but serious side effect, a neurological disorder called Guillain-Barré syndrome. Only about 100 cases have been reported out of the more than 12 million Americans who've received the J&J vaccine. NBC News health and medical reporter Erica Edwards is following the latest on the pandemic this morning. So, Erica, tell us more. What is this syndrome, and how are officials connecting it to the Johnson & Johnson vaccine?
Right. Good morning, Joe. Guillain-Barré syndrome is a neurologic condition in which the immune system actually attacks nerve cells. That can lead to muscle weakness and paralysis in some parts of the body. Now, those symptoms often pass within a few weeks. It's usually not permanent. It is most common in adults over age 50. Now, anytime a person develops a problem after a vaccine, it's reported to an online safety monitoring system called VAERS. And that's where health officials are scouring scour that information, that database, to look for any patterns of problems. That's where they picked up on these rare cases, these 100 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome. Now, I should point out that this link has not been definitively proven. Those cases are still considered preliminary and under investigation. Joe.
And Erica, what is Johnson & Johnson saying about this?
The company said that it had already been in communication with the FDA about these cases. It released a statement that read, in part, "We strongly support raising awareness of the signs and symptoms of rare events to ensure that they can be quickly identified and effectively treated." Joe.
So, Erica, let's take a look at the bigger picture here. This FDA warning is the latest blow to this vaccine that's easy to dole out because it requires only one dose. Can you remind us some of the other issues surrounding J&J's shot and the likelihood of someone getting any of those side effects?
Right. Well, the Johnson & Johnson vaccine was actually paused for 11 days in April after it was linked to rare reports of blood clots. The FDA later added a warning about that outcome as well. Now, both of these potential problems are extremely rare. In fact, those 100 cases of Guillain-Barré syndrome would represent less than 1/1000% of the more than 12.8 million doses of the Johnson & Johnson vaccine that have already been administered. Joe.
Let's talk about another one of the vaccines, Pfizer. Pfizer met with federal health officials yesterday to talk about booster shots. Pfizer wants regulators to approve its booster dose soon, but do experts think we need it at all?
At this point, no. Late last night, a spokesperson for the Department of Health and Human Services reiterated that at this point, there is no evidence that we will need a booster dose. Now, the vaccine is working well, even against the Delta variant. Pfizer, for its part, said it will publish data from its trials of a booster dose in the near future. Joe?
All right. We know we'll be talking about that one for quite a while. Erica, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll stay on that now with Israel offering a third dose of the Pfizer vaccine to some citizens as the Delta variant spreads across the country. NBC News global correspondent Rafael Sanchez joins us now. Hi, Raf. Good morning. Good to see you. So this makes Israel the first country to give out a third dose of the Pfizer vaccine, but it's not for everyone. I mean, as we just heard, though, from Erica Edwards, that this is not something that we're doing at this time here in the U.S. So tell us more about what's happening there, who these boosters are being made available to, and what research there is there to support this move. How'd they make this decision?
Savannah, that's right. We're here at Sheba Hospital, and yesterday at this site, the first people in the world to get that third dose of the Pfizer vaccine. But that booster only going to people who are severely immunocompromised, so they have weakened immune systems. So they started here with people who recently had heart transplants. They're going to go on to people who had liver and kidney transplants. After that, they're moving on to those getting chemotherapy for cancer. But it was two pieces of research from here in Israel that sparked the decision to go ahead with the booster. The first, they found that many of these immunocompromised people, even after being fully vaccinated, were not developing the levels of antibodies that doctors wanted to see. So some of the most vulnerable people in the population, not as protected as we would like. The second piece, Israel finding that 6 months or so after being fully vaccinated with Pfizer, people's antibody levels starting to decrease, not dramatically, but that is leading to a conversation about whether we need that booster shot. Now, I spoke to a senior official here at the hospital earlier. I asked him, you're starting with this immunocompromised population, but where do you see this going? Take a listen to what he had to say.
Their immune response is in many ways suppressed. That's part of their disease or their treatment. So those are the most prone ones to get I would say, a severe form of COVID-19. So it's very logical to start with them the vaccination process. Although if you ask my personal opinion, I believe we will end up vaccinating again the entire Israeli population.
So, Savannah, that is only his personal population, but that is a very senior official at an Israeli state hospital saying they're beginning with the immunocompromised. He sees them going next to the over 65s, eventually to the entire Israeli population getting a booster shot. And as we have seen again and again throughout the pandemic, Israel often sets the example that the U.S. and other countries then follow. Savannah?
So that is the plan, then, that this third dose would be available to the general public?
It's not the plan, but that is the conversation here, and individual experts like the official here at Sheba saying that is looking like it may very well be the trajectory here in Israel. A booster dose for the entire population.
Wow. So, Raph, that's obviously ahead of where we're at here in the United States. I mean, as I just mentioned a second ago, as we heard from Erica Edwards, that's not what we're thinking at this point. U.S. health officials are saying, nope, you don't need it. Something else, though, that we're kind of seeing a little bit ahead of us in Israel, of course, was the vaccination rollout. More than 80% of Israeli adults have been fully vaccinated. But now we're also still seeing those coronavirus cases increasing in large part because of the Delta variant, as we've been talking about. So break down the numbers for us. And what does that situation there in Israel indicate about the effectiveness of the vaccine if cases are rising when 80% of adults are vaccinated?
Yeah, Savannah. So two big findings from a recent study by the Israeli Health Ministry. The first, the Pfizer vaccine less effective at stopping infection with the Delta variant compared to earlier versions of the virus, down from the 90% range to the mid-60s. So every day in Israel, we are seeing hundreds of these breakthrough cases, people fully vaccinated going on to test positive. But the second finding, Israeli authorities would say the more important one, very few of those people getting seriously ill. Less than 50 people across the entire country in hospital right now with serious COVID. And that, they say, is a sign the vaccines are working. Savannah.
All right. That's great news still, and such important context. Raph, thank you so much.
Widespread drought and record-breaking heat are fueling dozens of wildfires this morning. They're burning all across the West Coast, from California to Washington State. NBC News national correspondent Miguel Almaguer has the latest on the fight to save homes and lives.
These are the apocalyptic conditions firefighters in Northern California face, a perfect recipe for disaster. Fueled by scorching temperatures and extreme drought, the Beckworth Complex fire doubled in size Saturday, grew by 20,000 acres Sunday, and forced some to run for their lives.
I'd planned on staying, but when you see the firemen running like that, it's probably a good idea to go ahead and leave.
58 wildfires are burning across the West. The Bootleg fire in Oregon, the nation's largest, is racing out of control.
Normally we see fire behavior like this in these big fires, not until August or September.
Extreme heat is also cooking the region.
This is a climate crisis.
Scientists say this is a clear hallmark of climate change. After the hottest June on record, Las Vegas and St. George, Utah hit weekend records of 117 degrees. Death Valley, an unbearable 130.
We're heating up the planet and changing the climate in a way that humans have never experienced before. And we're already dealing with the consequences. So it's a question of how bad do we want it to get?
The extreme heat is fueling this epic drought, and these conditions now surround more homes than ever. A catastrophic combination for fire season.
An ominous forecast as we enter a hot, dangerous, and already destructive summer. Miguel Almaguer, NBC News.
From the dangerous heat in the west to flooding in the east, there's a lot going on. Let's check on your Morning News Now weather.
There has been a lot going on for a long time. Bill Cairns, good morning.
I know it doesn't. I have to appreciate the slow days when I get them, because I forget what it's like sometimes in this summer. I know it's not even the peak of the hurricane season yet either. So, all right, so let's get to the fire information. We put this map together for you to show you where all the large blazes are burning right now in the west. And it's pretty widespread. I mean, from the mountains in Arizona to spotted the hills in California. I mean, look at northern Idaho and portions of western Montana with a concentration of blazes. So what we have is 50 large uncontained fires right now. So that means the firefighters do not have the containment lines around them. They are free to burn in any direction they want, depending on the wind and the weather. And right now we're at a national preparedness of level 4. Now level 5 is the highest, so we're almost there. And the Bootleg fire in southern Oregon is by far the biggest in the country. It's at least double the size of any other one. 0% containment and 50 structures are lost. To give you an idea, there are 1,000 firefighters on that Bootleg fire alone. I mean, there's a lot of firefighter resources out there trying to get these blazes under control. So for today, the heat numbers are going down. As we mentioned yesterday, yesterday. Slowly, it's getting a little bit cooler. That heat dome is weakening. It's still hot, but it's not as exceptionally hot, guys, as it was in areas of the West. And we did mention the East, and you guys mentioned it too, the endless days of rain. And again today, a chance of some severe weather in areas of western New York and Pennsylvania. In Boston, it has rained every single day so far in July, guys. Wow. And it's already their third wettest July ever on record.
Ugh, that's miserable. All right, Bill, thanks. We'll see you next hour.
Yep.
Tensions are rising in Cuba. Thousands are protesting the island's food and medicine shortages as the ongoing economic crisis there worsens. And in places like Miami, they're showing support, holding demonstrations, and demanding an end to the 62-year-old dictatorship. NBC News Chief Washington correspondent Andrea Mitchell has more on how U.S. leaders are responding.
Thousands of demonstrators spilling into the streets of Cuba this weekend, calling for an end to the 62-year communist regime. Chants of "We want freedom" echoing through the streets. Protesters dumping trash and throwing rocks. Demonstrations sparked by chronic food shortages and blackouts. In Miami, protests in solidarity with Havana.
We've been waiting for change for so long.
Maria Figueroa has family in Cuba.
I don't even know what their situation is right now.
An economic crisis exacerbated by the pandemic and no access to approved COVID vaccines. A perfect storm for anti-regime anger that spread rapidly as more Cubans recently gained access to the internet. Cuban President Miguel Díaz-Canel today blaming the unrest on U.S. sanctions.
The lack of medicine and food, all those topics that are embedded in our society as dissatisfaction, what is the origin? It's a blockade.
They simply are not hearing the voices and will of the Cuban people. People deeply, deeply, deeply tired of the repression.
President Obama established diplomatic relations with Cuba and removed it from the U.S. list of state sponsors of terrorism. But the Trump administration put Cuba back on that list, imposing tougher sanctions, which President Biden has not lifted.
We call on the government of Cuba to refrain from violence or attempts to silence the voice of the people of Cuba.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.